Well, yesterday in the same Superdome in New Orleans that hosted President Obama's residents displaced by Hurricane Katrina, the U.S. government auctioned off plots of drilling rights to the highest bidder. The EPA did bar one company from the auction, British Petroleum, the company responsible for the Deepwater Horizon accident in 2010, killing 11 employees and spilling up to 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Other oil companies made off better at the auction. Chevron, with the single highest bid of $17.2 million, won the right to drill in the western Gulf of Mexico, about 140 miles south of Galveston, Texas. Though Chevron got the top prize, ConocoPhillips will also pay $51.8 million for 62 tracts in the Gulf. And if you look at the top two institutional investors for both companies, you'll see some interesting similarities. State Street Corporation and Vanguard, both holding companies, own the most corporate shares of the two. Well, the top 13 oil companies submitted nearly $158 million in bids. The auction kicks off the Obama administration's new 5-year plan for leasing the continental shelf, all part of the goal to make the U.S. energy independent by the year 2020. But if all of the drilling is done by oil companies, including those like BP, which are owned overseas, is this really energy independence? To talk about this, we have Chris Williams, professor of physics and chemistry at Pace University. Welcome, Chris. So it looks like the U.S. will be producing more oil. This is right on track with a report saying that the United States will be the largest oil producer by the year 2015, not too far off here. But does being the largest oil producer, is that the same thing as being energy independent?
Well, I mean, one would question whether one even wants to carry on producing oil. Actually, the last year, there were more drilling leases handed out last year in 2011 than there were in 2007 under George W. Bush. So it's not too surprising that Obama would carry on handing out the leases. And Citibank did say that in the report that you mentioned, that to quote them, the U.S. could be the new Middle East by 2020 and outpace the output of Saudi Arabia, which is quite phenomenal. But what it really means is more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and more the risk of further spills, such as we saw in 2010 with BP. Because not only are they drilling off the shore deeper and deeper in the Gulf, but they're also wanting to drill for the first time offshore in the Arctic too, in that kind of pristine, very fragile environment. So many other reports, most recently by the World Bank, say that we are headed towards a catastrophic level of global warming, 4 degrees annually, 4 degrees by the next 50 years or so. And so primarily that's from burning fossil fuels. So I would question the logic of burning more fuel in the first place, let alone the question of when you think about how rich the United States is in terms of solar and wind power, why aren't we developing those as opposed to pouring more billions of dollars into oil companies, which are the most profitable organizations pretty much on the planet?
Now, energy independence, this is something that administrations for a long time have been working towards and kind of seems to be the ideal. I mean, especially with the turmoil that we're seeing in the Middle East and the fluctuation of oil prices. Wouldn't that be the goal for the U.S. to be energy independent, or are there drawbacks to that?
Well, I think that it matters why you decide how you're deciding your mix of fuels. If we're still relying on fossil fuels, I don't see the United States pulling out of its bases in the Middle East and having soldiers in Iraq, for example. I mean, it's impossible to explain Iraq without talking about oil, for starters. So energy independence, I'm all for the idea of energy independence, but not if it's based on more of the same fossil fuels. Because the reality is, part of the reason that the United States is able to produce more oil is because it's drilling in places that it never used to drill before. It's also fracking for natural gas, which means that natural gas has decreased. So coal can be exported, and coal is being exported in large quantities to places like China, for example. which is now ramping up its own coal production, which is adding to CO2 emissions. And then the US turns around and says, well, look, China's not doing anything about carbon dioxide emissions. They're burning more coal, but it's actually US coal that they're burning. So I don't see scouring the earth for more and more oil, which is not a renewable resource, is any kind of future for the planet. I mean, if we wanted to be really energy independent, why don't we rely on the sun and the wind and some mix of alternatives, as opposed to pouring more billions of dollars into a technology that we know is threatening the whole biosphere?
There's a lot of debate over whether wind and solar is efficient and feasible and affordable. A lot of people say that drilling is the way to go if we do want to become energy independent. I do want to ask you, Chris, because some people are impressed that the EPA is now punishing BP for Deepwater Horizon, but some financial analysts doubt that the London-based company's suspension from the U.S. federal government contracts will last. I want to read this quote. It's from Wells Fargo. States, we would be surprised if this suspension lasted beyond a few weeks or months, leaving no discernible effect on BP's drilling or development pipelines. That's according to Wells Fargo analysts. So what do you think, Chris? Will the EPA stand firm on this one?
I very much doubt it. If you look back at what happened with the Exxon Valdez spill, it didn't take long for Exxon to be back in the game, and the fines that they paid ended up being quite minimal. A lot of people have been talking about the historic level of fines to BP at $4.5 billion so far, and yet they've made $45 billion since that time, in the 9 quarters since that spill. So the fine so far represents 10% of BP's profits, which is hardly likely to deter them from asking for more permits. And they are the major company in the Arctic, for example, drilling up there, and have been for many years. So I would concur with the conclusion that you just read out, that I would start looking for new permits for BP to be drilling in the Gulf within the next few months, for sure.
All right. BP, like other companies, oil companies, are owned international. They're multinational companies. So if it is BP and these other companies that are drilling, would it really make us energy independent?
You mean if it's foreign-owned oil companies that are doing the drilling?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, I think that potentially, if you say that energy independence means you're extracting the fuel from your own country or from your own nation somewhere around it offshore, then if you define energy independence that way, then yes. But if it's a foreign company that's doing it, then you could question whether that really is independence. But BP is as multinational as Exxon, as ConocoPhillips. As you pointed out, 2 of the major oil companies have the same, actually major sponsors in terms of their shareholders. So it's true that the US is on course for massive expansion of its ability to drill for oil and its own domestic production. Whether that will lead to less international strife and warfare over natural resources such as oil, I think is highly disputable and open to a lot of debate.
Really interesting. I guess the debate is going to continue. Chris, appreciate you coming on the show. That was Chris Williams, a professor of physics and chemistry at Pace University.